Now, a lot of us are preachers, and all of us have our moral convictions and concerns, and so often we have problems with power. There is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love, correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see as we move on.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Raise a Glass, the podcast where we discuss the stories and storytellers that shape us. And today, in honor of Martin Luther King Day, we are talking about Martin Luther King Jr. But before we get into that conversation, I got to know what's in your glass, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. Today I was kind of like running around and feeling a little bit of that stress of life. And so I made the decision to have some tea.
Nice.
And so I actually have a chai tea that I put some like heavy cream in, and then hot water, and then the chai, like the tea bag. So I'm about to try it now and see if that was worth it, or if it was grossly a big misstep. We'll see. That's pretty good. I probably should have put another 3 bags of chai, but
yeah,
it's
all right.
I'm enjoying it. Yeah, out of my jelly mug. It's a piece of bread with jelly on it. We've got another one that's peanut butter.
Yeah.
And the mugs say, "You complete me." Peanut butter.
Oh,
jelly.
nice.
It's very cute.
Very cute.
Hunter, how about you? What's in your glass?
Well, I was thinking similar thoughts about my drink, but I went in a different direction. Kind of a long day. So I have some Top Box wine, red blend. It looks like there's a lot more than there is because I put an ice cube in it and it melted. But Top Box boxed wine. Pretty easy drinking red wine blend.
But it's from our very own sommelier,
yes.
Hunter Nansen.
Yeah.
You're wiping out your mustache.
I gotta shave at some point. It just gets to the point where it gets in the way eating and drinking, and then I'm like, I just gotta.
I can honestly say I've never had that problem.
Maybe one day. Are you pouring one out or raising a glass this week?
Well, I always do. So I was kind of on the same thought process of the decision to make the tea. I'm going to raise a glass today to breathing. Not just for the obvious reasons of, without it, we would cease to live.
Yeah.
But the way in which taking a deep breath, sometimes I'll do not too often, but sometimes I'll do a breath prayer where I'll pray one sentence as I'm breathing in and another sentence as I'm breathing out. And the way that can ground me, and that can be a very grounding, very stabilizing almost process. Yeah. And then I'm going to pour one out for large couches. So it's a fact that I love helping people move. That is a fact about me. I realize I'm in a small minority of voices when it comes to that opinion. I love it. One thing I do not love is moving a large couch into the back of a small truck while your child is crying and you're hangry and you're not communicating well with your spouse, and things aren't fitting the way that the math that you did said they should fit.
Yeah.
And so you use a lot of tie downs and hope for the best. And so that is what necessitated my raising a glass to breathing.
Yeah.
Hunter, how about you?
Well, I'm pouring one out for Amazon's abysmal support of their older Kindles, the Kindle e-readers. We've got an old like second generation one, and it only has like the 3G service. And Amazon, come to find out, discontinued the 3G service in like 2021 or something. So you can't sync it anymore. There's no way to sync it. You can still use it manually with a USB cable, and if you know where to get ebook files, you can put them on there. But so my family had like an extra one that had Wi-Fi, and they were gonna let me use it. And I was trying to get it to work, and couldn't log in with my account. Reset my password. Tried a dozen times. Like, apparently you're supposed to get a authentication email with a code from Amazon or something. And I never got one still. And I had to try like 4 different USB cables to get it to work with my computer. So, because I like to proofread on paper, but I can't print out a whole book. So, a Kindle or an e-reader, e-ink e-reader is the next closest thing to paper.
Yeah.
But just this support from a multi-billion dollar company is just horrible. Like, they just want you to buy a new one, really, and it's just got to pour one out. But I'm raising a glass to my local library.
Okay.
Because I was in there, and they had like a little book request sheet, and I had written down my book like a month or so ago, and I totally forgot about it. And then I walked in and I saw it on the shelf.
That's awesome.
And yeah, it was like the first time I'd seen my book on a shelf that wasn't mine.
And it wasn't just vertical. It was, you got the horizontal
Yeah, it was
spread.
in the new fiction section. I went in again and I signed it.
You did? Oh, I'm so glad to hear.
Yeah.
Were they excited?
I think, yeah, they were like, yeah, we'll put a local author sticker on it. And they're like, if you ever want to do a talk or something, let us know.
What?
And I was like, yeah. And I was like,
that's awesome.
Yeah. So our library is awesome. They have a 3D printer that I've been sort of utilizing as well. And the guy there is just so nice and friendly and so helpful. And they just do a lot of great stuff. So Douglas Library, thumbs up, raising a glass.
That's great. If you haven't had a chance yet to listen to the last episode of season 1, we raise a glass to Hunter Danson and Dawn Must Follow Night, which is the first of a series of fantasy books, fantasy sci-fi. What would you?
Yeah, it's a fantasy book, dark fantasy.
That Hunter has authored and is in the process of writing. Really good. Really enjoy it. Definitely worth a purchase of the book, and also worth listening to the episode. I learned a lot actually in that episode. I was, in case you didn't get a chance to listen to it, like, Hunter not only writes songs in his books, but is in the process of creating the songs to go along with the words. in the books. And so he actually gives us a little bit of a preview to a song in book 2. So definitely worth listening, worth checking out. Go for it.
Thank you. My number one hype man. It is, I do really appreciate it.
I love it. So yeah. I think I love the way you write, and I really enjoy the way you think, even maybe especially as it challenges me.
Speaking of challenging, this is a storyteller that you suggested and that you wanted to do. And I have to admit, I was a little intimidated, not because like listening to Martin Luther King and reading him, but more talking about him, because I don't feel quite as qualified as maybe I should to do a podcast on it. But you said that he means a lot to you, and that you've had a lot of great conversations. Do you want to talk about why you wanted to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. today?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm really, really excited for this conversation. We have only, I think, ever talked about one other storyteller. Most of our conversations are about stories. Right? We did an episode on Tolkien and talked about him as a storyteller.
Yeah.
And I couldn't decide on one particular speech or writing of Martin Luther King Jr.'s. And so I really wanted to focus on him as a storyteller. Because I straight up believe that I don't think there's anybody who's impacted our country more than Martin Luther King Jr. I think there are many people that might have impacted it as much as Martin Luther King Jr. But as far as and like the way we talk about stories and storytellers is not simply somebody who writes a book and publishes it. Like we have a very, very robust view of a storyteller and a story. Yeah. And I don't know if there's a better storyteller in our country's history than Martin Luther King Jr. And his ability to synthesize so many different storytellers and so many different stories together into a specific cultural moment. But that's not the question you asked. You asked why do I want to bring up Martin Luther King Jr. I'm sure this is not going to sound that interesting or that unique. I've always loved learning about Martin Luther King Jr. And as I was reflecting on it, and I'm sure anybody who's listened to multiple episodes of our podcast hears us talk about college and grad school and university, whatever, quite a bit. And so I was reflecting on the times when I've kind of spent time reading or listening to Martin Luther King. And I realized in the 3 years of grad school I did, 3 different courses, took 3 different courses that like delved into the writings and speeches of Martin Luther King. And I've seen the way that I view people, view issues of race, view the moral fiber of our country. A large part of that has been influenced by this incredible doctor, this incredible reverend, this incredible pastor, preacher, teacher, public figure. And I don't think that it's possible to adequately reflect on the year 2020 and the protests and riots and peaceful marches and righteous anger and backlash and changes that happened in our country in that year, in the 2020, 2021, without thinking of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so I also don't know if I would have been anywhere near as comfortable or confident, or those aren't the right words, as willing and like feeling the necessity to be acting in those moments and speaking, and really, let's be more honest, listening, and showing up. I don't think that I would have been able to do that without spending hours, hours upon hours, listening, reading, and talking about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I actually got the chance in one of my courses to dive into a comparison of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And actually, one of the 6 books I have in front of me is called Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Civil Rights Struggle of the 1950s and 1960s, A Brief History with Documents. And so I have a lot of views that are based off of a lot of primary texts. And one of the other cool things about Martin Luther King is that we actually have the opportunity to hear him speak and tell his stories, which is something that's unique among most of those that we've chosen to read. Or most of the storytellers that we've talked about. And so I don't think we've yet talked about a storyteller whose primary stories are speeches, are verbal pieces. So that's a little bit, that's a medium bit.
Thank you. How do you want to? How do you want this to go? Do you want to start with a particular speech or writing?
So I asked us to have to go through 4 different pieces for today. Did you have a chance to get through them?
I did, yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're going to go through them chronologically, and the pieces that I chose, and these are 4 I think rather relatively important and diverse choices, are Letter from Birmingham Jail, which was written, let me get the specific date, on April 16th, 1963. So we'll start there, and then we are going to move on. And for those who, there is a lot that we are not covering. And that's a challenge whenever you're making a decision to choose a few. And we're already not going to have enough time to talk about all 4 of these in depth. But that's what we're about, the stories and storytellers that shape us. And so I think these are 4. I think I chose these 4 for a reason. So that's where we're going to start. We're then going to move to I Have a Dream speech, which he gave on August 28th, 1963. Following that, we are going to skip ahead 5 years, or 4 years, to June. Let me get the specific wording. June 1967 is where do we go from here? And then we're going to end with Martin Luther King Jr.'s last speech on April 3rd, 1968, called I've Been to the Mountaintop. And so that's the order I'd like to have us go. The first one is written. The other 3 are all speeches. And so that will probably become evident as we talk about it. But what I would recommend, and we've made the decision not to have any clips of Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice in this episode.
I was reading about the copyright, and it's kind of complicated, and I just didn't want to. I didn't want to make a risky mistake, but I highly recommend going and listening to the speeches. You can still find them on YouTube. And I found an album of like comprehensive Martin Luther King speeches as well. It's just the power of audio, live audio, to take you back to that moment in history and his words.
Yeah, and that's actually another important thing to talk about, and it's more evident in talking about. It's going to be more evident in this episode than in others, but it's relevant to all of our episodes. Is that every story or storyteller we talk about is within a specific time, context, history, personality, and so there are pieces that aren't going to relate to us today. The use of the word Negro is not a word that we use. And so like at times we might quote, and that might be the word that's used. And so this just to really just, this is true about every episode, right? We read or talk about things that are specific times, specific groundings. And so I feel like I'm just trying to give a little bit of clarity. I'm not trying to give a disclaimer, even though there is the disclaimer that we're both white men, and that's been the case since the beginning of our episodes. And we talk about all sorts of stories and storytellers.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to share before we dive in?
I don't know. I might have some things to say about my journey with whiteness and thinking about whiteness and privilege, because that's something that I have wrestled with in society, but more importantly, or firstly, in myself and the way that I have thought about race and racial injustice. But we'll see where we go.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's
yeah.
I also wanted to say, and I realized we're just talking a lot before we actually talk, which is true to most of our episodes. Martin Luther King Jr., if I could meet three people from world history, I'm not sure who the other two would be, but Martin Luther King Jr. would be in my top three. I would, a large part of the way I go about, I have gone about like jobs and kind of next steps in my life is finding people that I want to be like and trying to be around them. Which is one of the many reasons why I married my incredible wife. I just want to be around Melanie. I want her to rub off on me. And I want to be a much better listener and communicator, among many other things that from her. One of the reasons I spent a lot of time around Martin Luther King Jr. and his speeches and things like that is because I want to be more like him. And not just in the way he talks and, in his ability to speak, but in the way he thinks. He's just such a deep thinker. And so as we start, we're going to start with Letter from Birmingham Jail. So written in 1963. This is a Pauline letter, or a Pauline-esque letter. That was a little joke for all those Christian epistle readers out there.
Oh, yes. So many of you will laugh at that joke.
Yes. This is a letter that Martin Luther King Jr. penned from jail in Birmingham after being arrested for marching in a nonviolent protest. And it is a letter specifically written to white clergymen, Christian and Jewish, who had been in the newspaper, or calling out.
A Call for Unity was the title of their letter in the newspaper.
and we're calling out Martin Luther King Jr. and what he did. And this is a response from Martin Luther King Jr. About everything from the logistical reasons why they chose to march to the political, social, spiritual, economic, cultural, historical. It's go for it.
I was going to say, I love how he says at the end, I have written a very long letter. And he says, but what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell, other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers?
So, Hunter, letter from Birmingham jail. This is something that's this is the work I love the most. Because I feel like it's most specifically like part of my journey in conversations with race and Christianity. And because I feel like in many ways, as I read it, I was like, oh, I might have been in that space. I like to think when I read it that I'm like, no, I would have been in, the small minority of white Christian leaders who would be marching with him towards the beginning of this time. But in reality, I think I might have been more towards a moderate, and my hope is that it would have pulled me, just like it has now in the last 10 years, into like realizing what does the implication of a lived faith look like? What does it look like to live out your faith where you are? And there's so many, this is just true about everything. Many of the stories and storytellers we talk about, and it's equally true, if not more so, for Martin Luther King Jr. His writing and speaking has so many just pure golden nuggets, and that just are timeless, and they're spoken in this specific time to a specific group of people, and yet they're timeless. So, like, one of the ones that sticks out to me right early on is the statement: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. But it really kind of goes back to that initial statement. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Yeah. That is often quoted. It's one of those quotes that you hear a lot, but it deserves it. So there's a lot of quotes you hear a lot that don't really deserve it, but that one does.
Yeah. When we talked about Macbeth, you went and quoted a lot of things that Shakespeare said that worked into our vernacular. And that was hundreds of years ago, right? Back now.
Yeah.
I don't know if people realize everything that Martin Luther King Jr. said or restated in such a way that it made it part of the national conscience. And that's one of the things that many of his speeches do. And two of the speeches, anyways, is they call out conscience, and they call us to think about what's true and the impact of the demonstrations in Birmingham and the decision to make them nonviolent and the process that Martin Luther King Jr. talks about by which they underwent similar situations to prepare themselves to respond nonviolently to violent oppressors. Are part of they made it onto national and international news, and called to attention to the white majority of people in the United States the clear, I don't have a better word than this, sin of, at that time, at the very least, the Southern institution towards Black men and women.
Yeah. I was struck. I had read it a long time ago, but I was struck this time around just how much thought went into the protests and the nonviolent actions, and how a lot of the decisions that they made about when to protest, where to protest, how to protest were informed by love. Like love for the city, not wanting to disrupt them economically by waiting until like after the Christmas season. And, there's also something about the timing of elections and votes. And I kind of listened through that, tried to listen to most of the album of his speeches. And there's one interview where the interviewer asks him about something that Malcolm X said about his nonviolence. And Malcolm X said that it plays into the hands of the oppressor. And Martin Luther King Jr. said that he doesn't view nonviolence and love as a weak force. He views it as one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And I think he is more than vindicated in that statement, and in the results of his protests and his actions.
Yeah. And he goes from there, and then he talks about the difference between a just and unjust law. In the process, he quotes Reinhold Niebuhr. He quotes Martin Buber. He quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. He I'm not sure there's anybody who was more widely read than Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this as I was rereading this letter about like, oh man, what would it take for me to be able to understand all like the depth of what he's saying, given the fact that I'm a white man and I live in the 21st century. And I was thinking about that in terms of reading. I was like, I would have to spend years just reading the names of people he brought up, let alone everybody else that wasn't brought up that influenced his writing and speaking. And while this is also gold, I want to push us into one of what I think is the hardest statements that he makes for me to read, or at least for the first times I read. If you're following along in the specific book that I'm reading, it's on page 81.
And what is the specific book that you're reading?
I already read Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Civil Rights Struggle of the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King he shares, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order, in quotation marks, than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, quote, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, end quote. Who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a, quote, more convenient season, end quote. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
That was a quote that I wrote down.
And Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't start with that quote, right? He talks about what the aspects of nonviolence and justice and roots it in his faith. And there are voices out there that I've heard that argue that Martin Luther King Jr. is not a Christian, not just yada yada yada. I brush those off as just unnecessary and untrue. Because I don't think it's possible to read and listen to Martin Luther King Jr. without the understanding that what he says and what he is rooted in a foundation that is not of this world and is rooted in a love that is not found in the lives of ordinary people without Jesus.
And I mean, going back to what I shared about how his decisions about nonviolence were informed by love, I could not possibly imagine how hard that would be to do. To imagine loving the oppressor.
One of the things I really appreciate about the way Martin Luther King speaks, Hunter, is that he calls out the systems and the way that people are viewed as they are. And so a large part of this narrative and this conversation around justice is the decision to do nonviolent direct action in order to force negotiations is a process that is pushing white America and specifically this time Southern Birmingham leaders to move from seeing Black men and women as possessions, and forcing them to see them as people. And not just people, but men with respect and dignity worth, because they're humans. And that's where Martin Buber talks about moving from I its relationship to I thou. Fascinating. Dive deeper into that as you want to. That's also where he calls out the letter that he's responding to by talking about, well, he goes to this whole piece, and I'm just going to read the last few sentences. I'm just going to read a paragraph. Let's be honest. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the acts by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that, As the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. I'm going to call it different themes as we read through these, talk about these different pieces. But one theme that exists that we might not have time to talk about is a conversation around the founding of this country and faith. And it's important to bring those up because Martin Luther King Jr. is both a preacher and a member in the public square, which is something that not many pastors, preachers today are. And honestly, let's kind of call it out. There is a luxury to being either a public speaker or a preacher. Mm-hmm. And that was a luxury that did not exist for Martin Luther King Jr. Mm. And it was, for him, those are directly connected. The way our society moves and our conversation about democracy is directly related with leading his congregation and his fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I think you probably noticed this throughout these four pieces. Martin Luther King Jr. has such a deeply, a deep and high view of the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence and
he's incredibly optimistic.
Yes.
About America.
Yes, and the depth of what those truths look like when they will be lived out. And that doesn't mean he celebrates all of the founding fathers. But it's also so clear, and we're not going to have time to talk about this. He actually goes out and speaks multiple times, at least once in the readings we went through, about don't think that you've caught me in a corner where I'm saying communism is the right thing. And he then talks about the way in which the communist views was based off of this thinker who was impacted by that thinker who led to that thinker, and democracy is this, and yet he calls out democracy, talks about the I at the cost of the we, and communism talks about the we at the cost of the I. And this idea, and this is so innate to Martin Luther King Jr., and I don't think the wording shows up in any of the four that we chose, of the beloved community. It's such a bring my hands together. It's just such it embraces much of what King is talking about in his foundation. We're going to move on to the next in a few minutes. Okay. A few more quotes. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God, or as Paul writes, co-heirs with Christ. The time is always ripe to do right.
Also, the bit where he talks about being labeled an extremist, because in the call for unity from the group of pastors that he's responding to, they label his actions as extreme. And he says originally that he is a little disappointed that they labeled them as extreme, but the more he thought about it, the more he was happy to be called an extremist, because in his case, he's an extremist for love, as Jesus was. And he talks about how the righteous frustration and anger and discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist.
Interestingly enough, Hunter, do you know what person outside of Jesus that Martin Luther King Jr. got the idea of nonviolent direct action from?
Was it Gandhi?
It was Gandhi. He spent a lot of time. I think he actually met Gandhi. I think that they crossed paths just briefly, but I might be mistaken there. He spent a lot of time watching, listening, reading, and seeing the impact of Gandhi's nonviolent direct action. And then the way that changed an entire country, an entire world, and understood it through, and then took time to understand it through the lens of Christ and Jesus's nonviolent direct action that happened on earth. That's one way of viewing things, but very true. So you were going to say more. I stepped in.
No, I was just going to keep reading the paragraph about being an extremist. But in all honesty, I think that this is a letter that deserves to be read at least once a year. I know I'm going to be doing that every Martin Luther King Day, and as often as I need to.
I don't know if you notice it. There are so many things that he talks about in this writing that just come up throughout the other pieces. Like this is like a fundamental core values to Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, and some really incisive critiques of society and the church in America. I mean, one of the things that jumped out to me was how he was greatly disappointed in the churches because they really didn't support his actions. And he says that the church, I long for the day when the church used to be not just a thermometer for public opinion. I long for the day when it was a powerful thermostat
that transformed the mores of society.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King is not speaking as somebody who's disenfranchised with the church, which there are many people at his day and many people, maybe many even more in our day, who raised in the church or not, who are disenfranchised with the church. Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking from a space of deep love, commitment, and belief in the church.
Yeah.
And in what the church can and should be. And the way Martin Luther King understands and describes, and the places where he's bringing them from, like from what the church is this beloved community that people long to be part of. Hunter, you and I have read the book Irresistible. That talks about what the church should be. Francis Chan wrote a book called Letters to the Church. That talks about what the church could be. Like the church and Jesus should be irresistible. And when they are lived out in a way that is indicative and true to the calling and to the work of the Holy Spirit, not through human love. Yes. And so we've walked through most of it. I had two other pieces I wanted to quote before we kind of dive to the next one. Are you okay if I jump into those?
Yeah. We because you did not just bring a letter from Birmingham jail. You also brought 3 other speeches.
Yes. And so I had planned to spend the most time on this. So it might be 50% this time and 50% on the others. Just because I think this is so, when I read books, Hunter, specifically for academic purposes, I spend 10 to 20% of my time reading the introduction or the prologue.
Forward.
What?
The forward.
Forward. Yeah. Those are usually tied together. The reason I do that is because I believe when you fully understand a well-written prologue, it's a roadmap to what's coming. When in Macbeth, we talked about the first sentence of Shakespeare tells the story.
Yeah.
And a well-written prologue does that. And this isn't the first thing he's written. It was, but I think that the next three things we'll talk about, that this is in many ways a type of prologue to what we will read.
A well-written prologue, because more so with fiction, I guess. I tend to skip the forwards and just go straight into it. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times if you have a classic novel, they'll spoil the plot. They'll talk about how important and amazing the work is. And it's really just so much more boring than reading the actual. It's like by the time you've gotten to the actual novel, you're like kind of annoyed and frustrated. And so I just skip it usually. But as you said, a well-written prologue can do so much more.
Yes. The last couple of things I want to talk about. The first is Martin Luther King Jr. is of the opinion that the ends do not justify the means. And that is one of the pieces about him that was so purposeful in everything he did and why he did it. And it wasn't just him. And so we talk about Martin Luther King. There are many other people that were involved in this, and he quotes them and talks about them. But it means that he's thinking about the means at all points. And it honestly, it makes him very radical. It makes him extreme. Because here he writes, over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. We think about the ends doesn't justify the means as what if you do something wrong to make something right, like that's not okay. But he's saying is if you do something right to protect something that's wrong, that's also not okay. And he talks about it, his willingness to undergo prison and ultimately death in the means, as in the pursuit of the means as well as the ends.
Yeah.
And I joked at the beginning about it being a type of Pauline letter because it's written from prison.
Right.
It's got this beautiful introduction. It calls out people. It dives into the depths in a very specifically rooted to that community. And then its conclusion also follows out of a Pauline letter. You read a little bit of it beforehand. It's from where he's writing from jail, just like Paul wrote many of his letters. Then he goes on, and I'm going to read the last two paragraphs. No worries, they're short. If I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates as an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me, to the church leaders. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you in strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. That's like almost verbatim from a Pauline letter. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours in the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. Hunter, do you ever get the feeling that the podcast we do is almost an unnecessary repetition of like of deep truth, of our attempt at understanding deep truths that are evident in different stories and storytellers?
Yeah. Maybe. I think of the podcast as like a really fun college class. You don't have a grade. You could choose what you study. It's like auditing a class.
I like that.
And because I miss learning. I don't miss like having it from a fire hose and like just not being able to sleep because I have so much work to do. But I miss. I still writing essays because essays help you learn, and I think that's what we kind of try and do. We try to learn and go deeper into art as and storytellers. As something more than just entertainment.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's a much. That's true, and it's a much more nuanced and positive view. And I think that yes.
I mean, if nothing else, I hope that we do so many quotes and things. I just hope it encourages people to just go read it and engage with it, and that's ultimately more important to me than people listening all the way
That's
through
true.
to the podcast.
And actually, from that, if you want to listen to one of these, but are like, oh, I only have 10 minutes, first, shame on you. Make more time in your schedule. But second, the shortest piece, which is what we'll talk about next, is I Have a Dream. It's also the most well-known piece of what he spoke because it was spoken. This is a stupid. You know how you like zone out, like tune out in the space. It's spoken from the footsteps of what the Abraham Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah.
There's actually a little plaque. I found a connection with Martin Luther King in my 8th grade field trip to Washington D.C. There's a little plaque that says, "And here Martin Luther King spoke, delivered his address." I found that while I was at the Abraham Lincoln Memorial, and like it meant something to me before I even like knew why. I'm just kind of reflecting on that now. And so this is, I think it's like 6 minutes and 38 seconds or something. It's a very, very short speech. And actually from my memory, I think a large part of it like was not planned. Martin Luther King Jr. in fact actually had a dream the night beforehand that like led him to change some of the stuff he had planned to write and say.
Wow.
Not all of it, but some of it. And so actually, this one, you might hear more page rustling. I'm reading from a book called I Have a Dream, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., forward by Coretta Scott King, his wife. And it's an illustrated edition with pieces from 15 different artists.
Can you at the end just give me all the like detailed information about the books that you're using?
Definitely.
So we can link them in the show notes.
These pictures, Hunter.
Wow.
They're stunning. And it walks through the speech. Actually was speaking it to my son before I went to bed. And actually today we listened to about 2 hours and 10 minutes worth of Martin Luther King Jr. together speaking. There are many aspects of this that we could talk about. I think one of the pieces that makes Martin Luther King Jr. such an incredible storyteller is his ability to craft the English language. And both in telling history, but then in the runs, that's kind of what pastors I was with used to call them, where you start speaking a little bit faster and having more repetition of words, right? So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightened Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from the Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring.
In the tradition of Augustine and many of the ancient sources that King cites, he was a great orator. Are there any specific points about I Have a Dream that you'd like to share that maybe we don't think about as much or aren't quoted as much, but
Yeah. One of the themes throughout King's work that is clear here is it continues a conversation about justice, and justice and injustice, and what they are, and the injustice that exists in our nation. And then another theme that we'll really see brought out in the third and fourth piece that we talk about is around the economy and around finances. He talks about being the Negro being given a bad check by the United States.
Yeah.
Like a promissory note that all men are created equal in the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, when you look at the reality of where he was speaking, and he dives into it more in his the next speech we'll talk about, that hasn't been followed through. And so those are a couple that I think are really important. And then that's just the other piece that we need.
Sorry, connected to that, one of the phrases that I wrote down is, he said that we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. When he talks about the bad check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had also noted, I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. And that's kind of the other theme. And then let's just talk about it before we go on to the next one. What do people remember about I Have a Dream? I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I got chills. And that's another theme that he talks about from right from the letter from Birmingham jail. Right, talks about his kids, and he gives this example of having to tell his daughter, "No, you can't." That commercial for that for that park, you can't go to there because you're not white.
Yeah, that was one part that hit me different this time as the father of a 2.5-year-old son. Just thinking about the look of despair that he gets sometimes when we tell him no, or he can't do something that he really wanted to do. And I can't imagine having to try to explain to him that he can't do something because of the color of his skin.
Please read Letter from Birmingham Jail.
Yeah.
I could quote the whole thing. I could just read the whole thing. It would take about as long as we've been talking so far. Because it's just, you need time to process it. And that whole piece about Fun Town being closed, and it's just what you just shared, Hunter. Yes.
And
yes,
and why they can't wait, because oftentimes the cry of the white moderate is wait. And there are many reasons why the time is now. And he very eloquently lists them and makes the case.
So, Hunter, we're going to dive into the next piece. So I'm putting the picture book away and moving on to Beyond Vietnam. Nope, we're moving past Beyond Vietnam. Listen to Beyond Vietnam if you haven't had the chance. It's also, will hit you. So I'm actually I'm currently looking at 2 books now for Where Do We Go From Here, both of which I've separately annotated and read and delved into. Let me talk a little bit about where Do We Go From Here is and kind of why we're reading it, or why we listen to it. Where Do We Go From Here is a speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on its 10th anniversary. And it is a conversation about where they have been in the last 10 years, really more specifically where we've been in the last year, the wins that have happened, and the movement that's going. In it, he also takes times to focus on the concern for the poor, the financially poor specifically, and continues to speak for he continues to communicate that he's against segregation and that he is for unconditionally nonviolence and a Christian love ethic. And at this point in this speech, and I don't know if we'll touch on it too much, he spends a lot of time talking about specifically economics. And this is actually a transition that kind of you start to see. And Hunter, did you notice this kind of skipping 4 or 5 years ahead? All of a sudden, the last 2 we're going to talk about these speeches. There's a lot more conversation about the economy, about money. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I did notice the part in Where Do We Go From Here, how he says that that Black America in his time is really one of the richest people in the world. Obviously at that time poorer than white America, but globally, they were richer, and they have an incredible power together.
The 9th richest country in the world at the time. And he goes through and starts naming them. The equivalent of the 9th richest.
Right. Yeah.
And he talks about Operation Breadbasket specifically within it. And Hunter, I want to really call this out. I feel like I hear and have heard the statement, and this might come across as like something that I shouldn't be saying, and so I want to say that. I've heard the statement that the experience for Black and other non-white Americans today, in 2023, is no better than it was 60 years ago. And even taking the moment to listen to these speeches, and I listened to them. I didn't reread them. I chose to listen to them. And the experiences, and like thinking about Birmingham and these pieces, like of where things were and the legislation that was passed, and I will not say, and what I'm not saying is that it's inherently better in every way now than it has been. But even hearing King's words about the progress that is made and has been made in the 10 years of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, both in very specific places, and he calls out specific places, but then across the country, like, there is progress. We are still not there by any means as a country, as a world, but definitely as a country.
Yeah.
But there has been movement, and we saw that in 2020 with different. What's the right word? 2020 and 21 with court cases and different punishments for, in different cases, police officers. We saw it in churches, and I can say for myself, I saw it in two different churches I was part of in two different states, both of which, one of which was predominantly white, one of which was not, but from a predominantly white grouping of churches. Both churches making the active decision to take steps into speaking on behalf and listening and apologizing and repenting of past sins that had been committed in their neighborhood, in particular against non-white men, women, and children. And these are churches that I think would have been part of the white moderate, and maybe still are. And yet those decisions were made, and they weren't just made flippantly. They're made very purposefully. And so I really do believe that there have been things that have changed. And I'm not saying that means change needs to end. I think Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, he would be continuing to push us forward.
I believe he said, I don't know if it's in this one or a different one. He said, one of the greatest tragedies would be to stop here. As far as, the progress that they made, the stir that they caused, and, the votes and everything, but that it would be a great tragedy for them to have come this far and then to have stopped. That might be in I've Been to the Mountaintop.
Yes.
But,
yes, it is. And one of the things that makes this a different piece than the last two we've gone through is not only the specific history being told, but this is spoken to an internal audience. Actually, this one and the final one we're talking about, I've Been to the Mountaintop, aren't spoken to the widespread United States. They're spoken specifically to people that have been in the journey with him. And that is what a beautiful opportunity to be able to kind of enter into like the keynote speaker of a conference. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing in this particular piece. And so there's a lot of specific names and specific examples, and they're awesome. I don't know about you, but like the piece where he was talking about Cincinnati, Ohio, I think it was, or some Cleveland. Sorry, I'm a Bills fan. We're playing the Bengals, Cincinnati on Sunday, so Cincinnati's on my mind. But talking about Cleveland, and I think it was the seal
test.
seal test, a specific brand of whatever, and a large part of this is, what does it look like to use your finances, and you use nonviolent direct action as a means. Nonviolent direction, and this is a thing that actually I think is a transition. Nonviolent direct action, along with directly in hand with economic withdrawal, which is what happened with the bus boycott. So maybe not, maybe just more of a step, maybe not a huge step, but a small step, to change economic systems. And this is where that statement of, we represent the ninth largest financial system in the world.
Ninth wealthiest.
Yeah, as Black Americans. And this is an amazing example where they're able to use those pieces in conjunction to boycott all of these particular products, and then go actually to all the different stores in this Cleveland area and boycott and tell the owners, we're going to boycott your store if you don't remove this. And this huge brand, and I wish I could remember the names of all these off the top of my head, and I can't. This huge store, which represents multiple, hundreds of chains, didn't, and all of a sudden the next day, they got a call. A&P. The next day, Mr. A&P, the owner, was calling on us, and Bob Brown, who is here on our board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and who is a public relations man representing a number of firms, came in. They called him in because he worked for A&P also, and they didn't know he worked for us too. Bob Brown sat down with A&P, and they said, "Now, Mr. Brown, what would you advise us to do?" He said, "I would advise you to take seal test products off all of your counters." Like, follow what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is saying. A&P agreed next day not to only take seal test products off of the counters in the ghetto, but off of the counters of every store A&P store in Cleveland. And they said to Seal Test, if you don't reach an agreement with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Operation Breadbasket, we will take Seal Test products off of every A&P store in the state of Ohio. The next day, the Seal Test people were talking nice. They were very humble. And then he talks about the economic impact of that and the being pushed. The problem that we face is, we also said to Seal Test, the problem that we face is that the ghetto is a domestic colony that's constantly drained without being replenished. And you are always telling us to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, and yet we are being robbed every day. Put something back in the ghetto. So along with our demand for jobs, we said, we also demand you put money in the Negro Savings and Loan Association, and that you take advertise in Cleveland Call and Post, the Negro newspaper. What an incredible way to he talks about those, and people are like, okay, like, well, what about that faith thing, right? And he talks about that in different parts. So I'm going to get there in a moment. But what an incredible way to live out like the values, like the deepest values of our country in a way that brings people together and makes a statement that calls out the economic powerhouses of the day. We are so easily thinking, and it's so easy to think in whenever we are. It's like right now that what we're experiencing has never been experienced before. Right, Hunter, you brought up Amazon earlier, the multi-billion-dollar company, and all these examples. And we think about, they have a monopoly, all these things. We're not going to be able to do anything about it. Like it's, with the little guy and all these pieces, and it's easy to get into this repetition. And we think that, and then we read something like this, and like very specific. And this is just one example. And one of the reasons that where do we go from here is so important for us to talk about is I think it does a great job of taking the mythos around Martin Luther King Jr. as this like non-human, is this essence, and grounds him in the reality of a specific time and what a group of people together, and he was the clear face and leader. Him and Ralph Abernathy, very clear. Also, Ralph Abernathy's name came up in at least 2, if not 3, of the pieces we read today. But Martin Luther King Jr., like you just see the specific examples in the way in which he didn't just call out the failings of democracy and the failings of the South and of our country. He focus in on what does it look like in this specific situation, and talks about Chicago. And he starts by saying, we haven't had any huge wins. And then he talks about these wins that I'm like, those feel like huge wins to me. And yet, this is where I started, we still face these problems today. And this is where this piece of it, the journey's not over. There's a quote that Martin Luther King Jr. shares that's deeply embedded in me. You've heard me say it before, Hunter. And I thought it was in Letter from Birmingham Jail. It's not. It's actually in a different speech he gave, which we didn't listen to. And it's, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And what I love most about that is that the reason Martin Luther King Jr. can say that and believe that and know that to be true is because of Jesus. It's because the justice has entered the universe. And we talk about our faith, but I'm not going to try and dive too push deep into that, and maybe we will at some point. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
I was struck listening to his speeches and reading the letter. And maybe this is a good transition to I've been to the mountaintop. I was struck by how hopeful he is and how hopeful his tone is and how optimistic he is about the future of peace and brotherhood in our country, which is something that I have sorely missed in a lot of what I have read and listened to and seen about what's going on in our country. And I haven't been the best at keeping track of everything, but he was filled with hope. And now we come to I've been to the mountaintop.
Yeah, well, and let me add a quote to lead into that from where do we go from here, because I think it dives directly into what you're saying and will lead us into that piece. Because the way he ends, one of the way he ends the speech, or towards the end, is he talks about the United States needing to be born again. And the whole structure must be changed. And he takes that from a conversation Jesus had with Nicodemus. He's like, how can I be born again? And he talks about what needs to be born again. And that's where the hope comes from, Hunter. And this is the piece where whenever anybody might argue, like, oh, it doesn't have faith, because that's what I hear. They're not. You haven't done an appropriate and a gracious reading of Martin Luther King Jr. Because you can't have hope in a broken system if you don't believe there's something or someone outside of that system that can fundamentally change it. And Martin Luther King Jr. didn't think that he alone could change the system. And he didn't think the system needed to be changed. He thought it needed to be reborn. And it wasn't that he didn't believe in the deep written roots of our country. Because in fact, he did. Deeply.
Stay true to what you put down on paper is what he says. One of the quotes that I've been thinking about from I've Been to the Mountaintop, talking about the founding fathers and the Constitution. Stay true to what you put down on paper.
I've Been to the Mountaintop is the final speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave in his life. It is one of the most prophetic things outside of the Bible that I have ever heard or written or read. I haven't written it. And in it, he talks about the Memphis sanitation worker strike. And he talks about economic pieces of it. But it's not just about that, as Hunter was talking about. And so while that's going on, he dives into this optimism that there are people that could call out Martin Luther King Jr. and think that part of the theme of his life is that he was moving closer towards Malcolm X, and Malcolm X was moving closer towards Martin Luther King Jr. And there might be there's some aspects of that there's truth. And actually a large part of that is Malcolm X's life and his views on brotherhood and things like that were changing pretty significantly. But at no point did Martin Luther King Jr. change away from his faith, change away from his views of nonviolent direct action, change away from his views in the possibilities of America specifically to be a place where this dream is realized. And I shared earlier that Martin Luther King Jr. would be one of my top 3 people to meet in world history. And it was partially because of the way that he begins. I've been to the mountaintop. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Where he stands at the beginning of time. And God asks him, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? And he says, I would take my mental flight by Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on towards the promised land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Pantheon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire, and I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders. But I wouldn't stop there. And he goes through the Renaissance to Lincoln, 1863 in the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he says, strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. That's a strange statement, but I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, the cry is always the same. We want to be free.
Thanks for reading that, Hunter.
Please go listen to the whole thing. I paraphrase some because he was a great orator, and this is a beautiful, beautiful speech. Thank you for bringing this, Eric.
I'm getting chills again. The repetition of, but I wouldn't stop there. The way he communicates that, the ability to point out specific points in history that means so much to him, right? He quotes Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. He's named after Martin Luther. He, thinks about the Renaissance thinkers. He's, deeply rooted in the United States history with the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he speaks about seeing that God is working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding. And he ends kind of this section with this statement. It is no longer a choice between violence and non-violence in this world. It's non-violence or non-existence. That is where we are today. And there's a few other pieces of this, Hunter, and please jump into the prophetic nature of it. Now I'm just happy that God has allowed me to live in this period, to see what is unfolding, and I'm happy that He's allowed me to be in Memphis. We'll get to more in a little bit later because it's way it ends. This is like that was my brain.
I love the part where he talks about how the New York Times wrote. I think he was stabbed at a book signing.
Yes.
The knife came close to his aorta, and the New York Times wrote that if he had sneezed, he would have died because the knife would have hit his aorta. He would have bled out, and he got a letter from a young white girl. She wrote in and she said, "I am so glad you didn't sneeze." And Martin Luther King says, "I too am glad that I did not sneeze."
That is one of those pieces that always gets me to tears. And let's just hit on a couple of these pieces that have been so clear. We've talked about these themes. Hunter, he also talks about, continues to bring up his faith. And he brings up the Jericho Road. And the parable, the story of the Good Samaritan, which, if you don't know, was one of the greatest stories in human history. It just is. And it has impacted over thousands of years. And in this story, there are three people that cross the path of a beaten up man on the side of the road who's almost dead. And the priest and the Levite pass by, these religious leaders. And then a Samaritan who is different race, ethnicity, background. I've heard it argued today, like this is like a member of ISIS stopping and taking care of a Jewish rabbi or the United States president.
Yeah. The relations between Jewish people and Samaritans at the time were violent.
And Martin Luther King talks about, these people passing, these two men passing, and he says, there's been a lot of theories about why it might be. And one of the things I always just die laughing. He's like it might be that they passed him because they were on their way to a meeting about improving the quality of the Jericho Road committee.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know, but the ultimate aspect of it,
is fear.
yes. And what he talks about is changing the narrative. And dang it, my version doesn't have it. This is really annoying to me. What the Samaritan did is he flipped the script. The priest and Levite asked the question, "What will happen to me if I help this person?" And the Samaritan asked the question, "What will happen to this person if I don't help him?" And that's what he calls the group in Memphis to do. And honestly, that's what he's calling us. And this is a takeaway that I think is paramount to Martin Luther King Jr. And one of the things, the questions, and the types of questions, and the ways of thinking that has and will continue to impact my life and I think our world, and I hope it does, is asking this question, and the white moderate, very specifically, right? Not asking, instead of asking the question, what will happen to me if I help this person? What will happen to me if I say that, stand up for that within my family? Or, if I call that out for being what it is? But flipping and asking, what will happen to that person, that group of people, my brother, that whoever it might be, or whatever it might be, if I don't? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're in a time where half the world sneezes and the rest of us catches a cold. Like, what does it mean to not stand by idly and say, "Oh yeah, that's an issue"? And I get it, compassion fatigue, right? It's so hard to do so much, and you're like, "Oh, Eric, you're doing empty platitudes," and you're kind of going off just like you did with Tolkien, because clearly you've got a crush on this guy and everything he says, and like, there's some truth in that. But what does it look like to stand up on behalf of others, to raise their voices, to speak when something needs to be said, and to care less about what's going to happen up to you than about what's going to happen to your brother, to your sister, to your friend, to your neighbor? And that's what the story of the Good Samaritan is about. It is about this question of what does it look like to be a neighbor? What does it look like to love deeply? What does it look like to stand unified with someone, even though they're maybe completely different and you have nothing in common? And it is radical. I heard it said recently that the parable of the Good Samaritan was just about being nice. And it's from a very well-known thinker on his podcast. And it was a gross misreading of the Good Samaritan. It's kind of like when Martin Luther King is talking about Nietzsche getting it wrong, been talking about power, because Nietzsche never understood what Christian love looks like. And then talking about Christian leaders getting it wrong when attacking Nietzsche, because they used Nietzsche's view about Christian love as their understanding of it, and then created this duality of power and love. When in reality, King's arguing for what does power look like when it's lived out through love, and the way that transforms. And like, Jesus was full of power and continues to be full of power through the Holy Spirit, and live that out in a love that toppled an empire. It toppled kingdoms, thinkers, leaders, ways of life. Like early Christianity, early Christians ended in infanticide.
Yeah. I have a question I'd like to ask. But
Yes.
before I do, I was wondering if there are any more pieces from I've been to the mountaintop, or other speeches or writings that you'd like to share before we end.
Yeah, there's only one thing, and I want to read the last paragraph of his last speech. I've been to the mountaintop. And I've talked a couple times about the prophetic nature. And this comes after he talked about getting on a plane in Atlanta and them taking extra time to go through all the baggage and all these things because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was on board, and there being active threats against his life. And there's a lot of arguments that there's thoughts that this might be related to his views on his push for economic change and his calling out Vietnam, the war in Vietnam. And he was very vocal about saying the war in Vietnam is wrong.
Silence is betrayal.
And so after that, he says, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I talked early on about the kind of the Pauline aspect of Martin Luther King in the letter from Birmingham jail. This is Moses. That's how Moses' life ends. Because of the sin he had against God, he wasn't able to get to the promised land. But he saw it. He was on a mountaintop, seeing the promised land, even though he knew he couldn't get there. But he knew that his people, one day, after an entire generation would pass away, and many other things would happen, would get there. And that final paragraph gives me hope. I think those words are still being lived out and still coming true today. And I know for a fact, Hunter, that you and I and our brothers and sisters in Christ, people from all tribes, tongues, and nations, will one day live in a world free of all the isms, where justice reigns. And I know that part of our life, part of living as part of the church, is to see that happen on earth as it is in heaven. Not through our own power, but through the whole power of the Holy Spirit and through Christ's work in our lives.
Amen.
So you had a question.
Yeah, I had a question. After that ending, I'm not sure how I could top the ending. Find a better. I'm not sure how we could find a better ending. But my question was, what are some practical things that we can do to be extremists for love, like Martin Luther King Jr. in 2023, and be a part of that vision?
So Hunter, I am still learning what this looks like, and Melanie and I have actively joined a church that is further down the road than us, down this road than us, so we can learn more. And so I'm not a person with all the answers, or I'd even say many of the answers. But I think that there's always the opportunity to listen and learn. And I had it said to me once by a professor. I came up to him after the class and was like, "Hey, like I just feel like it's the top of what I can do to like really follow the discussion. And like by the time I have something to say, it's like 10 minutes later, and we're on to something else." And he said, "You can be an active part of this discussion without speaking." And so I think taking the time to listen and to learn, listening to voices of people that you normally wouldn't, going out of your, and they could be from, Twitter, or they could be from a century ago, and hearing voices, and that's a large part of our podcast, right? We've tried, and we continue to listen to stories and storytellers from many walks of life. And I'm sure we've failed in that, but we've that's one thing you can do. I think that's a really big thing, and I think that that's not talked about often. And I think that one of the things that will happen when you take time to listen and reflect on that is that you'll start to see and understand things, or see and hear things, see and hear things that just don't quite make sense. Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the ghettos, and talks about economic pieces, and talks about the news and what's shared and what's not. And that's a large part of the narrative of what's happening to many of our Black and brown brothers and sisters throughout our country. And like the neighborhood that I live in, like we purposely chose to live in the city, and in and around a specific neighborhoods, so we could pour into our neighbors, not because we're people with the answers, but because we want to get to know our neighbors and to live intentionally. And we've heard a lot of things said about the city of Rochester, where we live, that are not based in a holistic view. If you so take time to think about that. Are your views on the city near you, or the group of people near you, or the immigrants at the border, or the refugee, or this group or that group, based off of one viewpoint, or are they based off a more holistic understanding? And so that's what's caused me to think of at times of like, hey, like there are a lot of counter narratives that are happening under the surface. A lot of incredible community events that are happening that aren't communicated. Building relationships is huge. Not forcing it, but taking time to build relationships, where you're doing a lot of listening. Authentic relationships, mutually transforming relationships, not one-sided relationships. You're not there to take. And like understanding that it is a lot for many of our non-white brothers and sisters it takes a lot to like share and feel like they have to hold a burden of answering questions about race and about lived experience. And so understanding that and going about that in a way that is full of honesty and openness, taking time to choosing to support women-owned and Black-owned businesses can be huge. Finding ways to use your finances purposefully. Those are just a few kind of thoughts off the top of my head that I've tried to add into my life and I'm still learning a lot about.
As are we all. Thank you for bringing this to the podcast, and bringing all of the hours that you have put in studying in class and outside of class, and many conversations, I'm sure. It has been really, really good for me to read and listen to Martin Luther King Jr. intentionally. And I hope that, because it's honestly, I hope you already have turned the podcast off and gone and actually listened to Martin Luther King Jr. Not to diminish what you shared, Eric, but
I agree. Hunter, thank you for jumping into this discussion. Again, I appreciate your honesty from the beginning about feeling like, oh, maybe this isn't the right, thing, and not feeling like, and just being willing to step into it.
yeah.
I really hope that I've at least the words that I've shared have been true to a more holistic understanding of Martin Luther King, and an aspect of who he is. And obviously, you can't get everything from 4 pieces,
Right.
but I am so excited for the way that Martin Luther King will continue to impact my life and continue to impact our country. And I look forward to the day when when you and I get to meet him, to thank him, and to offer pleasing aroma to the Lord and Savior through prayer and worship.
Amen.